Who here has worked for a terrible manager? Okay, no, hold on. Now, for those of you that raised your hands, which I think was nearly everyone, take a few minutes and kind of think about all the things that manager did that just, you hated. It just drove you freaking crazy. Just make a quick mental list for yourself. And now, okay, everybody got it? The list in their head? Go down that list one by one, and as a manager yourself, just do the exact opposite of everything that manager did. The few of you that didn't raise your hands, talk to somebody who did raise their hands. Okay? Great. We're done. Thanks. Do I leave the mic up here on the table? Are we good? No, I'm kidding. I think they'd maybe give back my hoodie if that was all I had for you. I do have a bit more to share, but first, some introductions. My name is Jim Rispin. I'm the director of IT at Fuller Theological Seminary. We're the largest multi-denominational seminary in the world with about 3,000 students, representing over about 90 countries. If you've never heard of us, that's okay. Just means I probably won't see you in heaven. I'm kidding, of course. We all know that the Masons are the only ones going to heaven, so that means none of us are going there. Except maybe Daw. I think he knows the secret handshake to get you in, so you can check him later. All right, enough theological digression. I've been doing formal management for about 7 years and participating in informal leadership for farther beyond that. If you've attended my talks in the past, though, you know this is usually the point at which I try to lower your expectations just enough to protect myself from serious ridicule. Well, not this time. This time I'm embracing the full arrogance of my talk and saying to you, I am a damn good manager. That felt good. That felt good. So, why are you here, besides serving as a significant boost to my ego? Put simply, we're here to make you better managers. To that end, here's what we'll talk about today. We'll explore some hidden disadvantages to the traditional path to IT management and how you might overcome them. We'll share some hard truths about management that the man doesn't want you to know. We'll learn some proven ways to build your best team from hiring to onboarding and beyond. Related to that, we'll talk about the importance of cultivating diversity, not only in your team, but for the entire IT industry. We'll talk about maintaining the proper care and feeding of your team, from one-on-ones to feedback to performance reviews. We'll discuss some things you can do to improve yourself as a manager, especially in the absence of traditional feedback from your boss. And we'll wrap it all up with a novel way you can communicate your values and practices as a manager to your team. Here's a few things we won't be learning today. I also want to get some important disclaimers out of the way before we begin. First, despite the obvious hubris of my presentation title, I am not a management expert. I have no MBA or other official manager training beyond what my own organization saw fit to run me through. However, management is something I'm particularly passionate about and also something I've had a decent amount of experience with. But my experience is not your experience. My environment is not your environment. So use this information as a starting point if you're new to all this, bless you, or as an additional data point if you're for your own situation. Second, I stand by my earlier assertion. I am a damn good manager. But that doesn't mean I'm infallible or all-knowing. I'm just as screwed up as the rest of you, probably more so. So if you try any of the ideas in this talk and end up in hot water with your own boss, please don't use as your excuse that you heard it from me at MacAdmins. Neither I nor the good people of Penn State need that kind of bad Yelp review. Third, this advice will be helpful, but it doesn't mean that it will magically make your job as a manager easy. Anyone who's done management for any length of time will tell you that nothing about it is easy. Management is hard, even more so when you're trying to do it well. Hopefully what we'll talk about today will give you some good strategies and practices to use in your own situation, but it's up to you to do the heavy lifting. Fourth, this advice is good, but it's only the beginning of the journey. Again, despite the arrogance of my session title and description, mine is not the be-all, end-all of management advice. Don't get me wrong, I think it's good or I wouldn't be up here, but there are a lot of good people doing great things in management. I'm hopeful that you'll walk away with new information that you can use, but I'll also provide some great additional resources at the end that can take you further along your journey towards management greatness. This one's really important. I've done presentations in the past on team development and motivation, communication, and managing up, and invariably someone tells me after the presentation, I can't wait to share this with my boss. Well, Let me talk you off that particular ledge right now. Do not share this with your boss. Sending them this link to the presentation is not a way of managing up. The presentation is really for you as you look to improve yourself as a manager or plan for the management position of your future. We'll talk about ways that as a boss, you can create space for your team to provide critical feedback to you. But even if you think this presentation is awesome, and I hope you do, it's a rare boss who can receive this kind of advice on how to do their job from someone who works for them. If you happen to be lucky enough to work for that kind of boss, they probably don't need to see this presentation anyway. Lastly, there will be some language. So, don't let my seminary background fool you into a false sense of purity. If you have delicate ears, it's time to leave now. Okay, with all that housekeeping out of the way, let's jump in and talk about what I consider to be the traditional path to IT management. Most of us start our careers doing the technical work we were trained for, or we fall into IT because of some demonstrated aptitude. We then spend several years cultivating the technical skills necessary to become better and better IT professionals. Maybe you went from tech support to sysadmin work to network administration, or maybe you followed the developer path and went from junior coder to data analyst to Eagle Scout developer. That's a thing, right? Can you tell I'm not a programmer? But at some point, many of us find ourselves with an opportunity to move into management. But there are 3 inherent disadvantages to this path. First, you've spent the majority of your professional life cultivating skills that will go largely unused as a manager. That's not to say that your experience in those technical roles won't inform how you manage people in similar roles, but much of your skill as a MacAdmin or senior developer will be of little use in management, because management is its own skill. The prevailing notion within IT is that if you come up through the ranks as an individual contributor and understand most of the jobs of the people on your team, then you're qualified to manage them. Not true. Knowing how to do someone's job does not qualify you to manage that person. It just means you can fill in for them when they're vacationing in Cancun or out with the bird flu. The second disadvantage to this path is the shared perception that frequently comes with your promotion. Because you're leaving the high-pressure, steep learning curve world of the IT professional, the move to management along this path is frequently perceived as giving up. You couldn't cut it as a Linux admin or a Ruby developer, so you moved into management. You've heard the folks say, those who can't do, teach, or those who can't play, coach. Well, I'll add one more. Those who can't code, manage. It's the beginning of the end for your career, the first phase in your looming retirement. Management is where IT professionals go to die, right? Bull hockey. Sorry, Grandma. The third disadvantage to this path into management is a greater chance of falling victim to imposter syndrome. Does anyone know what I mean by imposter syndrome? Basically, it's the overwhelming feeling that at any moment, you're going to get found out. That sooner or later, someone will discover that you are tragically underqualified to manage a taco stand, let alone a team of IT professionals. I'll let you in on a little secret. Everyone, and I mean everyone, suffers from imposter syndrome at some point, if not multiple points in their career. It can definitely be worse for some than for others, and we'll get into that more later when we talk about increasing diversity in your team, but just know that you are never the only one in the room feeling it. These 3 inherent disadvantages, believing that management consists largely of knowing how to do the job of everyone in your team, accepting the perception that management is the beginning of the end for your career, and being paralyzed by imposter syndrome, is why so many of us have had to work for mediocre or downright crappy IT managers. Your best bet for overcoming these disadvantages is to view the move to management not as a promotion, but as a complete career change. Accept that the skills that got you here will only loosely inform your new career. That management requires its own completely new and unique set of skills, many of which you probably already possess, but just need to cultivate. Embrace your new role as a manager, as a recruiter, as a cheerleader, as a coach, as an umpire, and most importantly, recognize this move for what it truly is, one of the most challenging and rewarding phases in your long career. All right, in the spirit of being better managers, we're going to make some public statements of commitment to one another today in the form of the non-shitty manager's pledge. So I need everybody to stand up. Strike your preferred pledge pose, hand over your heart, Boy Scout salute, take a knee, whatever you like. Now repeat after me. I, state your name, do solemnly swear. We'll get the rhythm, it's okay. That I will never lie to my team about anything, because that's just shitty. All right, have a seat. Oh, that's not all we're doing today. There's more. Okay, enough inspirational talk. Let's throw some cold water on your glorious life as a manager. We all grow up with very specific ideas about what it means to be in charge, right? Corner office, cushy workload, respect, power, authority, that whole bit. Well, let me follow the lead of Michael Bay and do my best to crush those childhood dreams by sharing some hard truths about management that your parents never told you. As an individual contributor, you have a ready-made support system. You tend to be in teams with other folks who do the same or similar work as you. This is especially helpful when you need to bounce something off someone or need to get unstuck from a particular problem or just need to rant to someone who gets it. But as a manager, there's usually just one of you. While there are other managers in your organization that you can and should look to, there's no one else running your unique team with your unique challenges, and that can lead to some intense feelings of loneliness. Of course, finding and building a support network as a manager is far from impossible, but it requires a level of intentionality not usually required as an individual contributor to a team. I mentioned this earlier, but many of us likely found our way into management because we were particularly good at something we did as an individual contributor. But in the role of a manager, you'll stop practicing that craft. Your role as a manager is to help your team cultivate and execute their craft well. So, unless you're still consulting on the side, those IT skills are going to get a little rusty. And that's okay. You're building all new skills that will benefit you and your team. A few years into your role as a manager, you may glance at a job description for something you used to do and realize there is no way you could do that job now. That's not to say you can't go back to being an individual contributor at some point. But if you're really going to embrace what it means to be a great manager, you won't have time to maintain your old skill set and build the required new skill set of a great manager. Incidentally, this is also why setting the expectation that you can step in and do the work of any member of your team at a moment's notice is a recipe for failure. As individual contributors, we love to get shit done. This is a central part of what defines us as IT professionals. We are the destroyers of to-do lists. But as a manager, your role as an enabler of people who get shit done, GSD turns into GTD. Now, not that GTD. Here we're talking about getting thinking done or getting talking done. And by thinking, I mean strategic and tactical planning, both of which require you to spend some time thinking through options, impacts, and costs of any particular plan of action. And by talking, I mean coaching, providing feedback, cultivating cross-team relationships, etc. If you're the kind of task-oriented person who loves nothing more than checking things off your to-do list, then as a manager, you may feel like you're not doing anything. But if you really can successfully make the transition from GSD to GTD, then you'll be doing the vital work necessary to help your team succeed. It's just not work that fits easily onto a to-do list. Again, the difference here between individual contributor and manager is stark. With any luck, as an individual contributor, you were getting regular feedback from your boss, specific praise for what you were doing well, timely, actionable criticism for what you needed to work on. But as a manager, your boss doesn't have the same visibility into your day-to-day work. And even if they did, the nature of GTD doesn't allow them to give the same kind of feedback on your thinking and talking work. In fact, your boss is more likely to offer feedback on something your team is doing, which certainly reflects on you, but doesn't provide any of the consistent, actionable feedback you need to grow. So at best, the feedback from your boss will come in fits and spurts. In addition, your team may not feel comfortable giving you direct feedback. We'll dive deeper into this particular challenge later, but just know that you're responsible for creating an environment in which your team not only feels safe to offer you feedback, but sees evidence of you making changes as a result of their feedback. I'll say it plainly. Sometimes being a manager sucks. Giving quality feedback, conducting healthy performance reviews, resolving conflicts, making and enforcing unpopular decisions made by you and those above you, it can take an emotional toll. The rub is, you're still the same person with the same emotional responses you had before you were a manager, but now you have to manage those emotions just as much as you manage your team. I still get nervous every time I have to give someone critical feedback, even if I know it's feedback they need to hear in order to grow. I still get angry with some entitled faculty member who decides to overcompensate for their insecurities by treating one of my team poorly. But becoming a manager didn't suddenly endow me with nerves of steel, the patience of Job, or the calm wisdom of a Buddhist monk. I'm still the same screwed up person I've always been. But if I'm going to be effective, I need to engage with my team and my organization in ways that are both professional and authentic. But that's only the half of it. Because not only do you need to manage your own feelings, but you have to contend with everyone else having feelings too. If you're creating the kind of environment where your team feels safe to express their emotions, and you should be, then you'll likely be on the other side of the table, if not on the direct receiving end of a whole host of emotions, not to mention some raised voices and more than a few tears. And if you have the normal level of human empathy, then some of this emotion will rub off on you, and that can be hard to take. Just be careful of two things. First, make sure these emotionally charged meetings don't turn into therapy sessions. Offer empathy, but maintain appropriate boundaries and objectivity. Second, give yourself permission to let off a little steam once in a while. Managing your own emotions as well as the emotions of your entire team can lead to some serious burnout in the absence of good coping mechanisms. So get some and use them. Turning to a coping mechanism in a time of high stress is not a sign of weakness. Quite the contrary. It demonstrates the emotional intelligence necessary to be a great manager. Lastly, take extra care in how you express your emotions around your team. They will take their emotional cues from you. By all means, be authentic and genuine, but if you lose your mind in response to every bad piece of news or unexpected situation, you give them permission to react in similar fashion and risk creating a chain reaction of negativity and stress that is best avoided. Don't let your emotion get in the way of providing your team clarity and direction, but do yourself a favor, invest in a good stress ball. This one is the flip side of getting less feedback. As an enabler for your team, when they crush something, it's them and not you who gets much of the credit, as it should be. Your role in these situations shifts from champion to cheerleader. This can take some adjustment, especially if your sense of value in your work has been tied to recognition. For managers who fully embrace this new role, the transition can be easier as they're able to find satisfaction and joy in the success of others. If you really struggle with this, though, you might need to find ways to highlight your own accomplishments in a way that still satisfies your desire for recognition without stealing the spotlight from your team when they really deserve it. All right, I'll say it plain. If you want to run shit, you have to deal with shit. In this case, this means two things. You have to protect your team from distractions so they can focus on getting their shit done, and you have to do the critical but mind-numbing tasks that no one else wants to do. For the first, you need to provide clarity and guidance for each member of your team in order to maintain their alignment with the goals of your organization. You also need to protect them from initiatives and projects that draw their attention away from these goals. If you're not providing this kind of protection, your team is left to fend off the attacks of other departments and teams all on their own. And that means they can't do what they're paid to do, i.e., get shit done. The second is less about saving your team from work and more about setting the example that you're in it with them. Everyone has some portion of their job that they just dread doing. But if you show them that you're as willing to take on as much of the soul-crushing stuff as they are, then it will go a long way towards creating a team that supports one another and isn't concerned with trying to pass off the shitty work no one else wants to do. Okay, before we move on, I want to pause to see if there are any questions about what we've covered so far. I also want to know that if someone has taken the initiative to start a Google Doc in the notes, or Google Doc for notes in the Slack channel in this room, I'll review it later today and answer any questions we don't get to this morning. So, any questions so far? Good, all right. Time for another Shitty Manager's Pledge. Please stand up. Assume your pledge pose and repeat after me. I, state your name, do solemnly swear that I will never lead by fear, intimidation, or cowardice, but instead lead with care, encouragement, and honesty. And I will always treat my team as adults. Anything else is just shitty. Have a seat. All right. We've laid down some hard truths about management. Since you're all still here, let's move on to something a little more upbeat and talk about how you go about building the best team you can for your organization. We'll begin appropriately with hiring. Hiring is possibly the single most important thing you will do as a manager. Nothing else you do has the potential to impact everything else you do to the degree that hiring can. It affects everything else downstream, for better or for worse. So getting it right or wrong dictates the type of relationship and experience you will have with that new hire for the rest of their time with you. If you're lucky enough to have an HR team that can help you in this process, definitely take advantage of it, but don't abdicate too much of the process to them. You and your team are the ones who have to live with whomever is hired, so make sure you're thoroughly involved in the process regardless of how many resources you have available to you. By way of example, I want to walk you through my own hiring process, but first I want to talk through a few important do's and don'ts for hiring. What does your organization value? Humility, initiative, sense of humor. Think about these things as you craft your job description and ultimately interview for the job. Hiring someone who's extremely ambitious into a low-key, family-oriented kind of organization creates a recipe for frustration, stress, and anxiety for everyone involved. Similarly, hiring someone who's a methodical, detail-oriented perfectionist into an organization that's extremely fast-paced and very decision-focused will create similar challenges. What are the basic competencies required for the job? Specific skills, experience, behaviors, etc. Start with the job description, but expand out to include traits and characteristics inherent to successful people in your team. And make sure you share this criteria with your hiring team. Make sure to screen for the right soft skills. Remember, these skills are much harder to teach than technical skills, so consider weighing them heavier depending on the position. Don't prioritize technical skills over relational skills or team fit. And make sure to ask questions in the interview that will uncover a person's level of emotional intelligence, as well as specific behaviors that might be problematic in your team. How do they resolve conflicts? What's their personal work and communication style, etc. If you think salary might be an issue, share it up front. Don't wait until the end of the process. It can be extremely frustrating to spend hours of your and your team's time interviewing, discussing, and planning for a new hire, only to have them bow out at the last stage when they discover the salary isn't where it needs to be for them. This is especially important if the salary is under market. Higher education, anybody? Or your potential candidate comes in with inflated salary expectations. Do everyone a favor and share the salary range early on, ideally at the beginning of your first phone interview. That's the best time for them to decide if it's a big enough deal breaker to even keep talking. It may be disappointing to lose a potentially strong candidate so early in the process, but it's better than getting your hopes up after you've evaluated them, interviewed them, introduced them to your team, and decided they're the perfect person for the job, only to be crushed when they can't take the job for the salary you're paying. If you think someone is a great fit for your team but aren't sure they have all the technical skills or experience needed to do the job, consider hiring them anyway and building them into the professional that you need. There are a couple of caveats with this approach, however. First, you have to have the time to bring them up to speed. If you need this person to hit the ground running with minimal training, hiring green may not be the right choice. Second, your team needs to be on board with this, since some of the training and development will fall to them. But if you have the time, resources, and team commitment to invest in someone, this can be an investment that pays off in a big way. Also, making this kind of investment not only breeds loyalty, potentially extending their longevity with you, but it gives you the opportunity to grow them into the exact kind of professional you need. And speaking from personal experience, helping a young IT professional grow in this way is one of the more rewarding aspects of being a manager. Hiring is not a solo sport. Even if you're a fantastic judge of someone's capability and character, there's no way for you to discern enough about a person on your own to determine if they're the right person for the job. Bring in enough different members of your organization to provide a diversity of perspectives and insights. This should include members of your team who will work alongside this person, but it should also include members of other teams who will interact with this person in meaningful ways. It can even include members of your organization who have a keen eye towards talent and understand your culture well enough to know who might be a good fit. Don't worry about wasting anyone's time. If you've done your due diligence early on in the process and have vetted the candidates you bring in, your colleagues will be grateful for the opportunity to speak into your process and help you get the best person for the job. According to the group at Glassdoor, it takes HR recruiters an average of 52 days to fill an open position. For someone with less skill in recruiting, say an IT manager, this time can be even greater. It may be stressful to take several weeks or even months to hire for a single position, and you may get pressure from your boss or even your team to move it along, but be patient and let the process play out naturally. Getting the right person for a particular job takes time and patience. Don't let the anxiety to fill the position shortchange your process. You'll regret not taking that extra time if a few months after hiring them, you need to fire someone who turns out to be the wrong person for the job. All right, this is going to be the closest I ever get to a live demo, so enjoy it. The following is a glimpse of my hiring process. Admittedly, this is my ideal process. Some of it doesn't always go the way I want it to with every hire, and some of it is frankly aspirational. But the fundamentals are tested and have generated consistently positive results. I start my process of hiring before the previous person even leaves the job, meaning after they've given their notice, and after I've had my appropriate but private internal reaction. But before they walk out the door for the last time, we have a conversation. I talk with them about what they learned, what they wish they'd learned, what they wish they knew going into the job, what they loved and hated about the job. It's basically my own little exit interview. I then use that information when I look at the job description and adjust it for the current needs of the team and the organization. This will require more or less work depending on how long the previous person held the job. Though, quick bonus tip about job descriptions and performance reviews. Every time you start your performance review with one of your team, look over their job description and update it to match how their job has changed since their last performance review. Not only is it a great way to clearly communicate expectations and define success for them while they're in the job, but it will also shorten the amount of time you have to spend rewriting that job description when they leave. Whatever you do, don't just copy and paste the previous person's job description into the posting and send it out into the world without at least giving it a fair review. Using my newly minted job description, I build a rubric of key skills and experience necessary for the job. This is basically a spreadsheet into which I can drop candidates and easily rank them. Now I just wait for the qualified applicants to flood in. Sometimes this can take a while. After I have enough good applicants, I'll score them against my rubric using their resume and answers to the application questions. Anyone with a high enough score automatically gets a phone interview. The phone interview process can demand a lot of my time, but it's a critical part of the process as it's the first opportunity I have to take stock of a candidate. I'll ask a lot of questions and take a lot of notes during this conversation. I also have a section of my rubric that allows me to further rank them. Some of my colleagues prefer to make the phone interview shorter and use the time for the in-person interview. For me, because I bring so many other people into the in-person portion, I want to make sure I'm maximizing their time for candidates who have a legitimate chance of succeeding in the job. Once the phone interviews are complete, I usually have narrowed down my potential candidates to 2 or 3 well-qualified people, which means it's time to assemble my teams for the in-person interview. I bring together 2 teams made up of people from my team as well as sister teams, i.e. people who work directly with this person every day, as well as folks from across the organization who will come into contact with this person enough that their insight can be valuable. Ideally, I try to keep each team to no more than 5 or 6 people so that the candidate doesn't feel overwhelmed. Nervous candidates make for bad interviews. The more you can make your candidate comfortable, the more accurate picture you will get of them. Candidates will then spend a couple hours with each team. In between the formal team interviews, I take the candidate out to lunch with the team they will work with every day. This gives us a chance to observe them in a more casual setting and frequently reveals aspects of their character they might not show you in a formal interview time. After all the interviews are done, we bring the teams together and debrief about the candidate. In some cases, I might ask the candidate to participate in some additional exercises like taking a StrengthsFinder quiz or writing some brief documentation or sketching out a quick mock-up for a project. I'll then gather all the data points and make a final decision about who I want to hire. But I have one final step that many managers will either mindlessly blast through or skip altogether: the reference check. This is easily one of the most valuable resources you have in the hiring process. It's never happened to me personally, but I know of managers who have learned things about candidates in reference checks that have completely disqualified them for the position. So you ignore this step at your own peril. I'll take special note of who the candidate provided for references. If a previous boss isn't among their list, I'll ask them for one. If they can't or won't provide one, that's a big red flag for me. It's completely understandable for someone to ask you not to speak to their current boss, but if they can't provide you with an old boss or even someone they worked closely with, it's not a good sign. It's fine to call their character references friends, pastors, family, whatever. but they won't be able to provide the critical insight you need to know what it's like to work with this person every day. Some of the questions I'll ask references are, give me an example of the kind of energy they bring to their work, or how do they resolve conflicts with their coworkers and their boss? What advice would you give to someone who had to manage them? And the all-important, if you had the opportunity to hire them again, would you? Here endeth the live demo. All right, before we move on from hiring, let me say a brief word about encouraging diversity in your IT hiring process. This is one of those topics that could fill an entire session, so I won't even pretend that I can adequately represent this topic in a few minutes. However, I do want to stress the importance of advancing women and people of color in technology. Obviously, this is not a problem that any single hire or even a dedicated company can solve on their own. It's also not a challenge that we'll tackle overnight. There are a number of systemic barriers that discourage or outright prevent women and people of color from pursuing careers in technology, and many of those barriers come into play long before you receive any resumes. So, give yourself the grace to make small but meaningful changes over time. It's also important to recognize that imposter syndrome is even more real for women and people of color. As I said earlier, everyone suffers from imposter syndrome at some point in their career. But one of the ways it can be alleviated is by looking around the room and seeing others like you in the same situation. Think then how it must be for women and people of color in technology who also might suffer from imposter syndrome, but who can't alleviate the feeling by looking around the room because there's very likely no one else like them in the room. Another important challenge to acknowledge and avoid in your efforts at increasing diversity on your team is the glass cliff. This is a term coined in 2004 by British professors Michelle Ryan and Alexander Haslam, and refers to the greater risk of failure some women and people of color experience when they're hired or promoted into positions they might be less qualified for. In other words, don't promote or hire someone just for the sake of increasing diversity on your team. If they can't do the job and you aren't prepared to support their professional development in order to help them do the job, you're just setting them up for failure and reinforcing the attitude that they can't do the work. That doesn't mean you shouldn't hire them if they're inexperienced. See my previous comments about hiring green. Just make damn sure you're prepared to provide them the resources and runway they need to succeed. Otherwise, you're ultimately doing more harm than good. Lastly, one of the ways we can all help address some of those systemic barriers I mentioned earlier is to take a look at how you're using your mentoring time for both your professional and private life. As Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook says in her book Lean In, it's important to find ways to pull up the less represented groups within IT. If we all make an effort to engage and lift up these less represented groups, we'll begin to see the fruits of those efforts in the candidates looking to join our teams. Okay, any questions at this point on hiring? Yes. Catchbox. And it's not even on. Come on. Okay, go. I think he's good.
Check. Hey, can you repeat those reference check questions? A couple of them were ones that I've used before, but a few of them were really great.
Let me go back to that real quick. There we go. There they are. Basically, what kind of energy do they bring to their work? How do they resolve conflicts with their coworkers and their boss? What advice would you give them? Would you give to someone who's managing them? And more importantly, if you had the opportunity to hire them again, would you? Any other questions before we jump into another pledge time? Oh, sorry, one more question here. It's coming.
You good? You ready?
I have a question about the interviewing process. So obviously you can see what skills they have on their resume for technical chops, but how do you bring out somebody's personality as you're interviewing them to make sure that they're not just putting up a front?
That's hard because there's folks who really interview well. I've had a couple of those. Really, the longer amount of time you can spend with them, the better. That's why I do team interview, lunch, team interview, to really make as much time as possible to really get a sense of who they are. In addition, I sort of try to discern as much as I can over the phone interview as well. So by the time I've made a decision on a candidate, I've spent at least 5 hours with them.
Okay.
And so it really kind of comes out. Also, you can kind of seed that with particular questions. I won't list those all, but I'll share those later. But there are certainly questions that will sort of highlight emotional intelligence rather than just technical skill.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it's pledge time. On your feet. Repeat after me. I, state your name, do solemnly swear that I will never take credit for my team's work or blame them for my mistakes. Because, come on, that's just shitty. All right, have a seat. Okay, you've just hired the perfect candidate for your job. Now what? If your organization's approach to onboarding is just to let the new hires sink or swim on their own abilities, odds are pretty good they're going to sink. You need to give them a clear onboarding plan to help them succeed. Onboarding will vary greatly from company to company, but ideally it's rooted in your organizational culture in a way that aids your new team member in getting up to speed quickly on that culture. But it also needs to include clear goals and expectations for their work from day one. Here are some of the ways I do this. I set up a 30-60-90 plan and meet with them regularly to make sure they're staying on track with it. Plans vary based on the requirements for the job, but I have some fundamental things that are a part of all my plans. First, I ask them to sit down for a one-on-one meeting with each member of their immediate team, as well as members of sister teams. These meetings help them to quickly understand the work their peers are doing and how the work they do can impact those around them. They also serve as a way to build the relational capital needed for them to do their job well over the long term. I also explicitly include tasks to help them get up to speed on basic tools of the organization, employee intranet, HR manual, phone system, time cards, etc., as well as basic tools used by the team, Slack, Google Calendar, ticketing systems, etc. I find it's better to be explicit about my expectations on this rather than just assume they'll pick it up on their own along the way. The last thing I include in all my plans is tasks aimed at building the foundation for their technical area of responsibility. This obviously looks different for each position, but if you have fundamental technical expectations for every member of your team, this is the time to set those expectations. Regardless of how you structure it, a 30-60-90 plan is essential for helping you determine if you've hired the right person for the job. If you get to the end of those first 3 months and find that they've failed to accomplish much of what was on their plan, then it might be time to consider other candidates. Without the plan, it could take you months or even years longer to arrive at that conclusion. I also assign them a buddy at the beginning of their onboarding time. Someone from the team who can help with questions when I'm not around. Where are the staples? Are there any good shawarma places near the office? How does the boss like to receive bad news? That kind of thing. Make sure the buddy is someone who enjoys this kind of thing and not someone who will be annoyed by the constant questions and interruptions. But don't use the same person as a buddy for every new hire. Another important part of our onboarding process that specifically seeks to introduce new team members to our organization and our organization to them is our IT scavenger hunt. This is something I developed years ago and continue to modify with each new hire. It's intended to get new team members out of the office, meeting people they might not meet for months, and learning things about the organization they might take much longer to learn or potentially never learn at all. This is not an easy hunt. I usually give them a couple of months to complete it, and they get points for each item they complete with various prizes at the end based on total points earned. It also serves as an added bonus by making our IT team appear more approachable. Rather than only seeing IT when something goes horribly wrong, this gives the rest of our organization a chance to interact with IT in a more low-key and fun way. I'll have a link to our scavenger hunt at the end of the slides if you want to try it out for yourself. Lastly, make sure you measure your expectations for their productivity during this onboarding time. If you give your new hire what they need to understand your team and your organization well, their ultimate productivity level will be substantially higher. So, how do you know which of these two categories the person you just hired will ultimately fall into? Unfortunately, there are some things you just can't learn about a person, based on her question, until you've worked with them for a while. But to help you know what to look for, I want to share a few qualities of exceptional team members, followed by some strategies for managing underperforming or difficult team members. This group of exceptional team member qualities comes from a longer article from Forbes that I'll include in the resources at the end of the slides. I'm not including all the qualities they listed, just the ones I think are particularly important. Also, keep in mind that these are not personality traits that some people have and others don't. These are emotional intelligence skills that anyone can cultivate. However, if you see one or more of these traits inherently demonstrated by someone in your team, it's a good sign you may have discovered a unicorn. First, they can delay gratification. One thing you'll never hear from an exceptional team member is, "That's not my job." Personally speaking, it's one of my least favorite phrases to hear as a manager. This person isn't bound by their job description and will look to step in wherever they can to be helpful, and more importantly, they aren't concerned with getting recognition or rewarded before providing that help. In fact, they're not even concerned if it ever comes at all. Next, they can tolerate conflict. This doesn't mean they seek out conflict, but neither do they run from it. And best of all, they're able to manage conflict in a healthy, calm, and respectful way. They have focus. Exceptional team members understand the principle of just fly the plane. In other words, they don't get so distracted by the chaos happening around them that they forget to focus on their critical work. They aren't rattled by entitled faculty members, office bickering, or the switch to a different brand of toilet paper in the bathroom. They can distinguish between real problems and background noise and can stay focused on what matters. They recognize when things are broken and they fix them. Whether it's a missing light bulb in the break room or an inefficient, wasteful process affecting the workflow of the entire team, exceptional team members don't walk past problems. The phrase, "it's always been that way," isn't something they will tolerate. They see problems as issues to be fixed. Simple as that. And finally, they're accountable. If you're a manager trying to figure out how something broke down, someone exclaiming, "It's not my fault," is not only irritating, it's remarkably unhelpful. Exceptional employees are accountable. They own the results of their work and their decisions, good or bad. They're also more likely to bring their mistakes directly to your attention rather than waiting to see if you find them on your own. They understand that good managers aren't out for blood, they're out to ensure everything and everyone is working at their best. Take note of what's missing from this list. Linux skills, years of experience, technical certifications, etc. These things are still important, but they won't make you exceptional. Shifting to the other end of the spectrum, let's talk about the slacker for a minute. Before you think I'm about to turn this into a gripe session about your favorite worst team members, let me say that while this can be the least sexy part of the job, it can also be where you do some of your best management. How you deal with a difficult or underperforming team member can define you as a manager. This is where that rubber of good intentions and promised ideals meets the road of repeated aggravation and soul-crushing disappointment. But before you assume the worst about your supposed slacker, ask yourself some hard questions. Have you given them the resources and support they need to succeed in their job? Is it possible that they're not a slacker, they just lack proper coaching or guidance? Is it also possible that you've misjudged their capability and they might be a better fit somewhere else in the organization? In other words, is this something that you can help them fix, or is this fundamentally a bad match for your company? If, after your soul searching, you still determine that this team member just isn't a good fit for your team, don't let it turn adversarial. Openly acknowledge that the current situation just isn't working, but then partner with them to figure out what's next, even if what's next is somewhere else. Obviously, once you reach the stage of termination, there's a lot more involved, which we won't go into today. Suffice to say, you need to partner with your HR team and not abdicate to them. You need to show compassion for your imminently departing team member, and you need to communicate the information to your team in a clear but respectful way. Firing someone from your team is possibly the worst experience you will have as a manager, but it also is one of the greatest opportunities to learn and live into your stated ideals. Okay, any questions? Awesome, we're moving right along. Okay, you know the drill. On your feet. Repeat after me. I do solemnly swear that I will trust my team to do their work and empower them with the resources they need to succeed. Otherwise, I'm just being shitty. Have a seat. All right. You've hired a stellar candidate. They've successfully integrated with your team due to your fantastic onboarding process, and now you can just sit back and watch the productivity roll in, right? If only. Now the work of guiding, supporting, encouraging, critiquing, and developing them begins. In other words, this is when the management really starts. This particular area of management manifests itself in three general areas: one-on-one meetings, performance reviews, and ongoing feedback. I've preached this particular sermon before, but one-on-ones are vital to the individual success of your team members, so make sure you have them. Beyond that, it's up to you how you and your team want to structure them. Frequency, length, location, content, it's all up to you. I personally prefer to have them no less than once a month, but every 2 weeks is the sweet spot. I also let my team set the agenda for their one-on-ones since I really consider it their meeting. I'll offer some general questions to help guide the time, but they're not obligated to answer them. I do try to avoid letting the time just be about general updates. It's all right to include them if they lead to celebrating wins or understanding mistakes, but it's not all that valuable just to list off all the things they've done since your last one-on-one. If you and your team struggle to come up with enough to talk about during your one-on-ones and you're not comfortable with my question framework, consider creating a Slack channel or a Google Doc between you and each member of your team to drop topics into in between meetings. Then you can use those to spark conversation during your one-on-one. Lastly, consistency is the hallmark of successful one-on-one meetings. So unless it's easy to shift them around in your schedule, try to keep your regular scheduled one-on-one meetings even if you're traveling for work, though not if you're traveling for vacation. The dreaded performance review. To know them is to fear them, but it doesn't have to be that way. If your approach to performance reviews focuses more on building up your team rather than tearing them down, it can be a rewarding and, dare I say, fun experience for everyone. All right, fun might be stretching it, but it can certainly be a valuable tool to help your team grow. Some key elements for good performance reviews are, well, having them, even if the rest of your organization doesn't. It is hard to overstate the value of a good performance review process done well. Make sure you're consistent, maybe even shooting to have reviews around the same time every year. At a minimum, they should be happening once a year with quarterly goal check-ins throughout the year. Nothing you bring up in a performance review should be a surprise to your team member. If you're waiting until the end of the year to bring up criticisms for mistakes made months earlier or praise for work long since completed, you're doing it wrong. Holding all your critical feedback and praise until review time is flat out disrespectful to your team. Everything you talk about in your review, whether praise or criticism, should be things you've talked about all through the year. The review process is your opportunity to aggregate all of that praise and criticism and use it to formulate goals for growth in the coming year. It's not a time to ambush your team with grudges you've been holding on to or watered down praise for successes you can barely remember. Make sure your reviews are genuine. Don't just go through the motions of your company's evaluation process, grading them as if they're school children. If you're not making a genuine effort to provide specific praise for work done well and thoughtful feedback on areas for growth, you may as well not bother. In my opinion, lazy performance reviews are worse than no performance reviews at all. Lazy performance reviews are also one of the clearest indications to a team that their manager doesn't really care about them or their growth as a professional. Make sure each team member also has a chance to evaluate their own performance. It's a great opportunity for them to highlight work that they're particularly proud of and make sure that it's not a one-sided affair. Take the time to also get intentional feedback from your team on how you're doing as their manager, though this shouldn't be the only time you're asking for that feedback, but more on this later. Again, just like one-on-ones, performance reviews can take a number of forms. We follow the prescribed process of our HR department with a few additional tweaks. We do our reviews roughly, admittedly, once a year. Each member does their own self-evaluation and sets some goals for themselves for the coming year. They also do an anonymous manager evaluation that goes to my boss, which he uses for my performance review. I'll do my own review of their work and also write up some tentative goals for them. We'll combine our respective goals in our face-to-face meeting, but before that meeting, I'll send them my completed review so they can read through and process it before we sit down. This is especially helpful if what I've shared with them might raise any emotions, positive or negative. This gives them time on their own to process and come into our meeting ready to talk about the review. If I wait to give them my feedback when we're sitting down together, it could be much less productive as I'm forcing them to deal with any emotional reactions in the moment. It also allows them to thoroughly prepare their own responses, making the conversation that much more productive. With the meeting complete and the goals established, it's extremely important that we revisit their goals throughout the year, ideally once a quarter. Whatever you do, don't wait until the next review a year later to check in on the goals you've set with them. Many things can affect their ability to achieve their goals throughout the year. The quarterly check-in allows you to course correct for goals that become harder to achieve or even set new goals when the previous ones are accomplished sooner than expected. Okay, hands down, one of the hardest things you have to do as a manager is provide feedback. It's a constant struggle to provide critical feedback that is actionable but shows care and offer praise that is both timely and specific. I've talked about enough of feedback over the years to know that this topic alone could also fill an entire session. So I'll try to offer some snippets of insight while encouraging you to read more on this topic and know that, like playing the saxophone, you can practice feedback for your entire life and never get better at it. When it comes to offering good criticism, be clear but kind. Care about what's good for them in the long term, not just what's easiest for you in the moment. Be clear and concise and make sure they know exactly what you think. Don't make them try to decipher your criticism. But also be open to the fact that your opinion might be wrong. If your focus is to offer candor and not truth, you can avoid the trap of coming across as arrogant and patronizing. Be humble with your feedback and it will be received with the appropriate level of rightness. Remember, being a boss is a job, not a value judgment. Don't let the inherent power afforded to you as a boss corrupt your thinking and destroy your humility. Just because you're the boss doesn't mean you're right. To help achieve that level of humble feedback, consider this approach from the Center for Creative Leadership. Situation, behavior, impact. Situation. Describe the situation and be specific about when and where it occurred. Behavior. Describe the observable behavior. Don't assume you know what the other person is thinking. Impact. Describe what you thought or felt in reaction to the behavior. For example, I might offer Chris here some following feedback. Hey, sometimes when you're in a meeting, you have a tendency to express yourself a little disrespectfully, and that can create some challenges for you and for us. That's remarkably non-specific. Doesn't really underscore any impact and leaves Chris wondering how he's supposed to respond. Instead, I might try this. Hey Chris, last Monday in our team meeting, you got visibly frustrated with Tom, dropped your pants, and shoved your butt in his face. That behavior is altogether unacceptable, can expose us to litigation, and could ultimately lead to your termination. Situation. Last Monday in our team meeting, behavior. You got visibly frustrated with Tom, dropped your pants, and shoved your butt in his face. Impact. That behavior is altogether unacceptable, can expose us to litigation, and will ultimately lead to your termination. Now, that's obviously an extreme and fairly clear-cut circumstance. Most of the time, the circumstance leading to your feedback will be much less black and white. Nevertheless, following this approach can produce concise, actionable feedback. However, even if you give actionable feedback, don't get upset if your team member doesn't immediately act on it, especially if the impact isn't as clear-cut as my example here. If you know that they thoughtfully considered your feedback, that should be enough. Plus, it will set the stage for an easier feedback experience for both of you in the future. So, offering praise is sometimes even more difficult than offering criticism. But one important thing to keep in mind is, if it's something you'd say to your children, it's probably not a good praise for anyone in your team. Like, I'm so proud of you, champ. To help you craft specific praise, try to answer these questions. What does this team member do that no one else can do? And what do they add to the team's work that wouldn't be possible without them? If you can answer either of these questions, your praise will probably be pretty specific. Then you just need to make sure you're offering this praise more than once every few months. Okay, any questions on caring for your team? Right here.
Would you mind going back to the one-on-one meeting questions, please?
I'll include those in my notes at the end.
Right,
So.
thank you.
This is kind of a particular to higher education question, but I'm wondering if you have any advice for mitigating the we have a degree and you don't issue that you can run into in higher ed, and how you kind of help your team along when they don't necessarily have those doctorates.
What she's describing is when you're engaging with faculty, for example, who have spent their entire years cultivating sort of this persona of being knowledgeable. You put them in a position where they don't know anything, and they feel the shame and tend to react poorly to that. That's what she's describing. My best advice in those cases, because I dealt with this when I was even in tech support, is to acknowledge that they're really good at something, and just because they don't know this doesn't mean they're stupid. Just like I can't fix a car, but it doesn't make me stupid. I have to go to a mechanic to help me fix my car, just like you need to come to me to help me fix your computer. You're very good in a lot of areas. And so it's sort of an acknowledgement of, you would totally get this if you had spent, the time that I have, just like I would totally get what you do if I'd spent the time you have. Just, it's a fair exchange. But it still can kind of be challenging, and at times you just have to work past it or just sort of work through it to get where you need to be. So, okay, ready to move on? Pledge time. Everybody up. Now repeat after me. I do solemnly swear that I will treat the members of my team as human beings with hopes, dreams, and lives of their own outside of work. I will not treat them as expendable cogs in a machine, overworking them and tossing them aside like so much bull hockey. Sorry, Grandma. Because that will be really shitty. All right, have a seat. My dear, sweet, departed Canadian grandma, never cared if you cussed. You just couldn't take the name of hockey in vain. All right, so you've built yourself a great team, but how do you build yourself into the leader that they need you to be? Well, I have a few suggestions, and the first one's probably pretty obvious. Read as much as you can, as often as you can. There is a lot of material on the topic of managing and growing as a leader. Andrew mentioned in his talk on managing Mac Nerds yesterday that he only reads management books when he has insomnia, and he's not wrong. Admittedly, some of the books out there are better than others, but the more you read, the more you're able to refine your own management philosophy and style. I'll have some suggested reading at the end if you're unsure where to start. Convincing your team that you both are open to and eager for their feedback can take some doing. First, you have to acknowledge and appreciate the inherent power dynamic between you and your team. This power difference can make it difficult for your team to open up and share what they really think about your work as a manager. Even if you're the poster child for the open and understanding boss, odds are that most, if not all, of their previous bosses have not been. So they've been conditioned for their entire career to keep their opinions to themselves, not to mention the notion that their parents likely drilled into them that if you can't say something nice, audience. So don't get discouraged if they don't immediately take you up on your request for feedback. If you keep at it and demonstrate that yours is a safe office in which everyone is encouraged to help each other grow by offering respectful and caring feedback, then eventually they will cotton to the idea and start to tell you what they think. Then it's on you to nurture their newfound courage by doing something with that feedback that they offer. If, after establishing a safe space and continually asking, you still can't convince your team to provide honest feedback, you might need to look elsewhere in your organization. Seek out one or two people you can trust to tell you the truth. It could be someone on your team, a fellow manager, or an insightful mentor. Whoever you choose, make sure they have the necessary visibility into your work or can engage with the people around you to provide the kind of constructive and actionable feedback you need. Don't just look for colleagues who will tell you what they think you want to hear. Also, look for someone your team trusts who will be candid with you and make it clear to everyone on your team that they are free to talk to this person if they don't feel comfortable coming to you directly. In the interest of encouraging a culture of candor amongst your team, the good people at Candor Inc. have a host of helpful resources. At a minimum, you could go a long way towards improving your skills as a manager just by reading Kim Scott's book, Radical Candor. I've mentioned their work in the past, but for those new to the idea of radical candor, let me briefly explain the model. Radical candor brings together two key ideas: caring personally and challenging directly. These represent two fundamental states of management. You either give a damn about your team or you don't. And you'll either risk pissing them off in order to help them grow, or you won't. According to the Candor Group, as a manager, you'll naturally fall into one of these four areas. You may visit some of the other areas from time to time, usually by accident, but in the absence of strong self-awareness and based on your inherent personality and style, you will usually find yourself gravitating to just one. So, what do each of these represent? Beginning with the top left corner, we have ruinous empathy. This is when you really care about your team, but you just can't bring yourself to give them critical feedback for fear that you'll hurt their feelings. Or your praise is so non-specific that your team has no idea what they did well. In many organizations that consider themselves nice places to work, this is where most of their managers live. In the bottom left corner is manipulative insincerity. This is when you not only don't give a damn about your team, you do nothing to help them grow as professionals. If you do give feedback, it's usually unclear, non-specific, and downright mean. I'm going to take a stab in the dark and say that this should describe no one in this room right now. Otherwise, I have grossly misjudged my own appeal. In the bottom right corner, we have obnoxious aggression. This is when you really suck at caring for people, but you are laser focused on telling everyone what you think about their job performance and how they can get better. It may sound harsh, but if you can't achieve radical candor, this is honestly the next best place to be. At least with this approach, your team can grow professionally, though I'm not sure how long I want to work for you. And finally, we have radical candor. Obviously, this is the sweet spot you want to strive for. This is that intersection between caring personally and challenging directly. This is a place where the praise you give is specific and the criticism is delivered with kindness. Another helpful tool for discerning areas for growth as a manager and as a professional is the Johari window. Is anyone familiar with this? Really? Okay. This is an experiment that allows you to confront aspects of your personality and style that you might otherwise miss. It can uncover some harsh realities that can be difficult to face, but if you've got the courage, it can also provide some valuable insight into how your team perceives you, allowing you to grow beyond those perceptions into a better manager. The Johari window is made up of 4 quadrants. In each quadrant are characteristics or qualities that you possess, organized by how they are known to you and those around you. Here's how you build your own. Start by picking 5 or 6 adjectives from this list that you think describe you best. It's not meant to be a comprehensive personality test. Just pick the handful of words that give the most accurate picture of you from your perspective. Now reach out to several colleagues whose opinion you trust and ask them to do the same. Keep it to no more than 10 for simplicity's sake. If you can find a way to anonymize this process, all the better, as you'll likely get more honest feedback. If Pam back there wants to tell me she thinks I'm an impatient, boastful jackass, she's much more likely to do it if she knows she can do it anonymously. Even if you ask people to be honest, no one likes to risk hurting someone else's feelings to their face. So try using something like a Google form that doesn't record username or email address. Now take all the words that you chose and those your colleagues chose and fill out your window. Words that both you and your colleague chose go into the open box because they're known to everyone. Words you chose but your colleagues didn't go into the hidden box because those are aspects of yourself that you haven't shared. And words your colleagues chose but you didn't go into the blind box because those are traits of which you are completely unaware. Obviously, nothing goes into the unknown box because it's, well, unknown. Now take some time to sit with the results. Start with the hidden box and try to determine why you're not showing what you believe to be your true self to the people around you. Then move on to the blind box. What are you projecting that you're not aware of? Some will likely be good things. Maybe you'll be surprised to learn that people find you mature and wise, probably because they don't know you still wear Batman underoos. If so, lean into those traits and trust your instincts in those areas, but you're just as likely to learn things that you're projecting that you're not so happy about. Even if you don't understand how someone could see you as impatient and unapproachable, the fact remains they do. And if it matters, it's up to you to change that perception. Okay, any questions on building yourself up as a manager or improving your skills? Okay then, you know what time it is. This is our last non-shitty manager's pledge, so once more with feeling, please. I solemnly swear that I will stand up for my team at all times, advocating for their financial and professional growth at every opportunity, and defending them to those who would disparage or demean them. Doing otherwise is just shitty. Thanks for that. Okay, I got one last thing I want to share before we wrap up. Many of you will probably remember this, but for the young whippersnappers in the room, back in the old days of software distribution, every time you installed a new piece of software on your computer, it came with a corresponding README document. This was the essential information you needed to get started using that piece of software. Well, I recently discovered a number of managers taking the same approach with their teams using a manager README to communicate all the things that make them unique in how they do their work. It occurred to me that not only could this get your working relationships with any of your new team members off to a running start, but it can also set them up for individual success in a way that no training or HR manual ever could. I have a link at the end that I'll share with a number of examples of README documents, but I also wanted to quickly outline a process you could use to build your own manager README document. First, provide some basic explanation about what this whole weird document is about. Odds are pretty good that none of your team have seen this before. So help them understand that it's a supplemental tool to help you to get to know each other. However, make sure they also understand that it's not intended to be a replacement for actual human interaction with you. Next, tell them about you. What are some of the most common things you like people to know about you? Share as much as your personal boundaries will allow, but remember, if you want to cultivate trust in your team, a little bit of vulnerability from the leader goes a long way. Next, share what values and principles are most important for you and highlight which ones you want the people in your team to emulate. This is also a good place to share some of your default assumptions about people and how you tend to react to them. You might also take the opportunity to share some of your more relevant pet peeves. Briefly explain the team's approach to one-on-ones and how you like to give and receive feedback. And finally, outline specifics on the best way to share information with you and how your team should reach out to you, especially in mission-critical situations. Hopefully, if this idea appeals to you, this will give you a good starting point to begin to build your own README document. Make sure your team knows that, like all good documentation, this is a living document, subject to revision and improvement. And like your management skills and expertise, it's a work in progress. Well, that's all I have. As promised, here are some suggested books for reading and to help you explore further. They'll be in the slides, you'll get them. Or take a picture now if you like. And here's some additional resources I mentioned throughout my talk. And with that, I'll take any additional questions. Do you guys not download the slides?
Jim, do you have any specific advice for very small teams of just 2 or 3 people?
A lot of this information still really applies. You should still be meeting with them one-on-one. You should still be setting expectations and defining success and all those kinds of things. I've talked about this with Tom and his situation too. For consultants who have smaller teams, this is still relevant. You maybe are a little more challenged in terms of that sort of peer feedback if you're a manager trying to get that kind of feedback, though you could turn to other consultants as well. So that's what I was recommending, I think, last year when Tom brought up the question about, as a consultant, it's a different environment, but you have a whole host of peer consultants that you can treat as a larger organization and use it to the same effect. Yeah.
So when you said don't forward this presentation onto your boss, how would you recommend managing up and trying to get your new to being a manager boss to A, do one-on-one meetings, and B, take the weekly team meetings and turn them into something productive?
Send them my presentation from last year.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding. I did do a whole talk on managing up, and a lot of it is really sort of, if your boss is reluctant to do one-on-ones, frame it in a way that helps them succeed in their own goals. Frame it to say, hey, I want to make sure that I'm doing what you need to do to succeed, and that you're, meeting the success that your boss has defined for you. In order to do that, we need to be talking, and we need to be talking regularly. So, yeah, if you make it about them, you got a better chance of getting success.
In situations where someone wants to move into the management area, but there isn't much opportunities to really prove that your leadership material, because for whatever reason, what kind of advice can you provide for people like that where they it's just those are kind of opportunities are few and far between, and
right. I'm just talking off the cuff here, but I think anything you can do to make the traits that you have that you think would make you a quality leader, anything you can do to make those visible, things like this, would be, really valuable. Volunteering, even if if you can't get any traction in your own company, look for ways outside to cultivate that, so that when it comes time to go look for a job that you think will be, right in your wheelhouse of moving towards leadership, you've got other experience that you can draw from that isn't just the company you're working for. So there's organizations you can, volunteer for that would cultivate leadership skills that you want to be able to cultivate. So that's, it's a little bit of a off the cuff, but. One up here.
Do you have any suggestions for a manager switching jobs, like going into a new role at a different organization with a new, fresh team?
Yes. The key thing you can do as a leader in a new organization is shut up and listen. I have zero patience for leaders who come into a team and just plow ahead with their own agenda and don't stop, take stock of the landscape, listen to the people who've been there, who have the experience with the organization, and don't appreciate that as a resource. You should spend a lot of time just talking to people for the first several months. Definitely, this kind of README document would be super valuable in that kind of scenario. So the team that you're working with gets a quick picture of you and knows and then live into that document, of course. Don't just write it and kind of just do something else. But listening and engaging with people early on and learning as much as you can about the organization as quickly as you can is vital. Any other questions?
There's someone else.
Last chance. Oh, one more.
So years ago, in my early 20s, I actually became a manager of my
Wait,
own.
I thought you were 25.
Oh,
You look 25.
thank you very much. I keep counting down every year. So I became manager of my own peers. I had been working for a department for about 4 or 5 years and learning everything I could. I was eager. And I found out that managing people that I used to work with was really difficult. What advice do you give about that type of situation?
I've actually been in that situation where I was working as a senior sysadmin with other sysadmins, and it's a senior role, but you're still effectively peers. And then I moved into an assistant director role, and suddenly the dynamic shifts. And the best thing you can do is just name that and have an open conversation about, we have different roles now. I would still want to support you and encourage you and do what I can to advocate for you as a member of the team, but our relationship is not the same anymore. So just acknowledge that power dynamic and don't make a big deal out of it. And then just be willing to kind of give each other grace as you adjust to this new relationship. It's pretty key, I think, so.
I've got kind of a, what are those Russian nesting dolls called, situation of...
Matryoshka dolls.
Yeah, sure, of management at the moment. I recently moved into a management position in a new organization, and in that new organization, we just restructured the organization so that a handful of the people who were field techs are now lead field techs who have direct reports of their own who were their peers previously, and the lead field techs are now my direct reports.
Wow.
So
you're managing managers who are just new managers.
Exactly.
Awesome.
And I myself am a new manager in a new organization.
Good times.
So, what advice might you be able to give to someone who's tasked with managing a new manager?
Managing managers is a
peers?
little bit of a challenge too, because I don't know if nothing's really jumping to mind at the moment, but it is a slightly different dynamic. The one thing that I think is helpful if you're managing someone who's managing other people. So, for example, I have within my team, there's a subset of a team that someone else manages. I'm loosely, affiliated with them. I try to, maintain connection, but I'm not undermining the authority of the person who actually leads that team. So you want to be careful about that, first of all, that you keep that kind of structure intact and you make it aware you're available for them to come talk to you if they're having trouble with their own manager, for example. But in general, you're not going to undermine the authority or allow people to triangulate. So if somebody comes to you, for example, struggling with their manager, you're going to have a talk with them and you're going to let them know, we're not going to pass secret information back and forth, and you can't just come to me and expect that I'm going to fix everything. It's got to be an open conversation. And I'd say for your situation, yeah, just lots of open, honest conversations that you're all in this new, but let's all be in this together, and kind of figure it out and give each other the grace and time we need to kind of learn this process.
So my question's kind of orthogonal to our discussion here today, which is, as someone who is a new manager and is concerned about doing less individual contribution. I mean, stepping away from that IC role is hard. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of made that easier for you?
It's not easy.
Okay.
And there's still things that I have in my bucket of to-dos that are sysadmin related work that I have not been able to pass off to people. And that's probably always going to be the case, regardless of what kind of management role you have or what organization you work for. This is the last question because we're out of time. But I would say make your team aware that it's not your job to do their job. It's not your job to know their job. That your job is to really make them and resource them to be the best they can be. And that means a variety of things like I spend a lot of time meeting with other people across my organization. I had to kind of reconcile that with the idea of it's not the work I'm used to doing. Sitting down and having coffee with people 3 times a day sometimes doesn't feel like work, but it is genuinely work. It is information gathering. It is relationship building. So I'm a conduit of information for the organization into my team, so they know what's going on across different departments. We can anticipate, priorities and projects and work that way. But it also builds relationship with other departments such that when we have to work with those teams, that working relationship is so much easier. So the relationship building and the relational capital that you need to build as a manager looks very different than what it would look like if you're just doing that regular day-to-day to-do list kind of work. But making that shift, give yourself some grace there too, but be diligent about handing that stuff off that you really shouldn't be doing anymore. So, all right, we're out of time. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.